Hello and welcome to the next Bible study on Genesis. I have to say this study is becoming not quite what I initially set out to do, which was a little bit of an overview, maybe 2 or 3 weeks on each character. I'm a little bit stuck in Abraham at the moment, but when you see the richness of what's in his life and the things we can learn, I thought, well, at the moment we got all the time in the world to keep going each week and building the picture of what's going on in Genesis. So I thought, let's just take a little bit more time on Abraham, or maybe quite a bit more time, and pick out some of the absolute gems that are in there and the things that we can learn from him. So I'm going to pick up in Genesis 14, and it's a story where a bunch of kings gather together and they go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and while they're there, they basically plunder the place but take off away Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, and they run off with him. And so Abraham, he's not going to sit back and just let it go on. By the way, I should have said Abraham and Lot had split earlier, and the reason they split was that there was this battle that was developing between the two of them, and the battle was basically there was an argument going on about the resources, and so by going separate directions, Lot had looked at the plains where Sodom and Gomorrah were, and yeah, the amazing thing is he'd looked with his eyes and seen with his eyes what looked great and taken hold of it, and Abraham had allowed him to go that direction because Abraham's sights weren't set on an earthly inheritance, and we'll see that again in a moment. His eyes were set on a heavenly inheritance. And so you've got Lot, and really he was living in this on this edge, in this place of compromise. Sodom and Gomorrah represented compromise, and so he was getting caught up in the place of compromise. So I just want to pick up here, what goes on when this battle happens, and they run off with Abraham's nephew. As it says, since he'd been living in Sodom, he was right in the middle of it. And Abraham's response in Genesis 14, verse 14, he said, when he heard his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went on in pursuit as far as Dan. And I absolutely love that little statement. There was something important to him, that the people that he chose for this battle were ones that had been born in his household. And he knew exactly, there were 318 of them. I love that detail in the Bible, that it's not there was a bundle of them, but in this case it was important to God and important it was written down. 318 people born in his household. And there's something, isn't there, when we walk with people over a long period of time, and I think one of the most precious things I have in ministry and in church leadership is there's so many people, I know Sue would say the same, that we've been able to walk with, not just for, I know some, they're new friends and we've walked with them a short period of time, but there's people that have been walking together for, decades, and I find that an incredible honour and privilege, because in that time, there's always all sorts of ups and downs, and we've learned a lot about community and living together. And so Abraham had these trained people that went with him. And so basically they made this attack and they won. And then as he's coming back, and this is the bit I want to pick up today, it says Abraham returned from winning, and it says the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley, and it said it's called the King's Valley. And it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Now, this is so rich in things that we could learn. I'm not going to have even the slightest chance to get into all the nitty gritty, but here's a couple of things. Melchizedek was a king, and Melchizedek was a priest. And what we have, and you can go over into Hebrews, particularly Hebrews 6 and 7, and a little bit in Hebrews 5, and you can see that Jesus is described, as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. What was Melchizedek? Melchizedek was a king and a priest. And that was one of the uniquenesses of Jesus. He was king and he was priest. In the Old Testament, they had the kings, and the line of kings, not the lion of kings, the line of kings. And you also had the priestly line. They were separate. But in Jesus, they came together. But here, you've got the shadow, the foretaste, this is God's plan of Melchizedek, who was a king and a priest. And it's just incredible. You go and read in particularly Hebrews 7, you see that he's described as king of righteousness, the king of peace. All these words that would describe Jesus. Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. There is no genealogy for him. There's no beginning, no end. And like Jesus, he had an earthly genealogy, but there is no beginning and no end to him. He was there at the beginning and he is there at the end. He's the Alpha, he's the Omega. But here's the thing in this passage, which is just absolute gems. So Melchizedek, the king and the priest, what's he do? He brings out the bread and wine. Now you think of Jesus. What did Jesus do? On the Last Supper, Jesus brought out the bread and wine. As such, when he became the sacrifice, he became that offering for us of the bread and the wine. He became the covenant meal. It's a whole different thing to look at. But Melchizedek setting the example, he brought out the bread and wine. Jesus brought out the bread and wine to his disciples. He shared the bread and wine. He said, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you." He said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And then he said, you won't do this again until I'm in glory. There's all sorts of things to learn about bread and wine. As a little aside, if you've got a few minutes this morning, whether you're on your own or with someone, why don't you, take the bread and wine and just remember Jesus? Just think, Jesus, he brought the bread and wine to you. So Melchizedek here, he's a king, he's a priest. He brings the bread and wine and he blesses Abraham. You see, the bread and wine is a blessing meal. It's a meal of blessing. When you take bread and wine, you sometimes lose this fact, but you're taking the blessing of God on yourself. You're receiving the blessing of God. It's not a blessing that leaves, but it's a blessing that grows and grows and grows. So take some bread and wine and be blessed by your God, Most High, Creator of heaven and earth. And then it says this. It says that Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. You see, again, it's another subject. But you can see the richness of this scripture, the whole area of tithing. See, the Old Testament principle, was tithing. In other words, giving 10% of everything they had, of all their crops, of everything. They gave 10% back to God. They saw the 10% belonged to him. And so that's the bit they gave back. And I know some people love tithing and embrace it. Other people struggle with it. But here's the deal. In the New Testament, it's no longer about tithing. Some people go, "Oh, that's a relief." It's about everything. See, in the Old Testament, it was about a slither. In the New Testament, Jesus gave everything for us. So everything, absolutely everything we have is his. So if there's a debate about tithing, we should need to change our basis. Tithing was the Old Testament. The New Testament's about everything. The New Testament's about being a cheerful giver. The New Testament's about generosity of heart and generosity towards one another. So if you don't believe in tithing, you're already limiting yourself. If you only believe in tithing, you're already limiting yourself, because we're called, to give everything and live from that basis. So they have it. And again, you can pick up some of the more complicated bits about that in Hebrews, but Hebrews 7. But it's well worth looking at some of the arguments and the basis there. So Melchizedek brings the bread and wine. He's a prince, he's a king, and he's a priest. And then he brings a blessing. Then Abraham gives him 1/10. And at that point, basically the king says, "I'll give you everything." And and keep all the goods to yourself. And Abraham says, I won't do that. He said, I'll accept nothing that belongs to you, absolutely nothing. I don't want you to say, Abraham, you made Abraham, or Abram as he was known there, rich. You can read that, Genesis 14:23. And so Abraham refuses something that could appear like the blessing of God. Yeah, I wonder, are there times that we've considered ourselves blessed, where it's not actually a blessing of God? It's like you go to the shop and you get double the change and you think, I'm blessed. No, it's not that moment. That's not blessing. That's someone's mistake. And a righteous heart is one that will go and say, actually, I'll put this right. I'll sort this out. That's not how the blessing of God comes. So Abraham, having been blessed, could say, wow, he's spoken the blessing and now I've received all this stuff, and he wouldn't. And I'm not going to go into detail this week on this, but you step over into Genesis 15 and what happens? God comes to meet with him. It says, and we'll pick this up next time, it says, the Lord came to him in a vision and he gave him a promise. What was the promise? The promise was that he would have, an heir who would be from his own flesh and blood, who would inherit what he had. Up to that point, basically, Abraham thought it would be a servant, that would inherit the estate. But God had a greater plan and a blessing and a release for him. You see, sometimes we can lock in on something earthly, looking for blessing, but Abraham, by keeping his eyes, keeping his focus in the right place, released a most extraordinary heavenly blessing. And you can see that in Genesis 15. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop there and we'll pick up on Genesis 15 next time. But just grab hold of the richness of this passage. Melchizedek, a king and a priest, a shadow of who Jesus is. He brought the bread and wine. Jesus brought us the bread and wine, or brought it to the disciples. There was a statement of blessing that came through the bread and wine, which is a statement of blessing that's also available to us. Abraham didn't get locked in on an earthly blessing. Now compare that back to Lot, where I said Lot saw what was a good plain, good land, and said, I'll live there. And Abraham didn't get locked into that either, but he received a heavenly blessing, which is just so much greater. So as I finish here, just want to encourage you, take bread and wine if you have a moment. Ask the blessing of God to come on you if you have a moment. Consider your generosity of heart and make sure you're fully flowing in that grace that God's given to you. Bless you. Have a great few days, and I look forward to being back with you next week.